Well, in case you missed the last 20 years of Fox News coverage around this time of year, or even just the recent letter to the Harvey County Now, we're still apparently in the war on Christmas. Each year, right-wing media and a handful of conservative Christians who buy into right-wing politics and theology raise the alarm that Christmas is under attack. Their evidence is that some people say Happy Holidays or Season's Greetings, especially store clerks, instead of saying Merry Christmas. They continue to claim to be victims of an attack on Christmas, even though over 70% of the U.S. population says they're Christians, and even though Christmas is the only federally recognized holiday that's religious, and of course that religion is Christianity, and even though we literally organize our school and work calendars around this Christian holiday, and even though our cities around the nation, including our own, continue to use tax money and to decorate for this holiday, to decorate our downtowns and to host things like Christmas parades. So that's a lot of evidence that Christianity is a very much endorsed religion in the U.S. and that Christmas is going strong. In fact, maybe stronger than ever, depending on how we measure it. For example, the National Retail Federation estimates that this year we'll spend between $218 and $226 billion on Christmas. And that's between $10 and $20 billion more dollars than last year. From my perspective, if there is a war on Christmas, it isn't because Christians are no longer able to force everyone to participate in our religious rituals. It's because we as Christians so often fail to keep Christ in Christmas, turning it into a festival of consumption. And even worse, we fail to keep Christ in Christian. Our Christmas warriors are angry that public schools cannot include Christmas pageants and that store clerks say Happy Holidays. But they are rarely angry that children are born in poverty, that immigrants are still imprisoned along the U.S.-Mexico border, or that homelessness is rising. And these are the themes of Christmas. So, yes, perhaps there is a war on Christmas if we consider Christmas to be something other than coerced participation in Christian consumerism. Christmas is a season of remembering Jesus' birth, including its promise to cast down the mighty from their thrones, lift up the humble, fill the hungry with good things, and send the rich away empty. It's also a season for remembering that this effort has always been met with resistance, with both overt violence and the violence of systems, which in Christianity we call principalities and powers. These are systems that oppress, including unjust economic systems, unfair legal systems, environmental racism, and other structural ways of doing harm to God's most vulnerable, and therefore the people God is most tender toward. This war on Christmas is not some new conflict rooted in rising levels of secularism. It is instead as old as Christmas itself. This is also not the story we depict on Christmas cards or Christmas pageants. But if Jesus is the reason for the season, we might also add that Jesus is the reason, inadvertently, for the massacre of the innocents, a scramble for political power, and the refugee status of Joseph and Mary's family. When Jesus declares in Matthew 10 that he, quote, came not to bring peace, but to bring a sword, we remember that it was his birth, not just his ministry. His birth, not just his ministry, that inspired violence. Today's text from Matthew 2 is a familiar one. The text doesn't clarify this, but Herod the Great, the Herod here is Herod the Great. He's the first of 5 men named Herod the Great, 2 sons and 2 grandsons, and they'll all rule. The second Herod is the one who beheads John the Baptist when John rebukes him for an affair with his brother's wife. His father, though, is equally violent. Herod the Great has been declared king of the Jews by the Roman Senate, and presumably he likes his job. He's ruled for more than 30 years when the Magi enter his life with this weird warning that a child has been born, king of the Jews. That sounds like a more valid claim to authority than Herod's appointment by the Romans. Further, The NRSV text, translation of the text, says that the Magi identified the place of the new Messiah's birth because they witnessed his star at its rising. And if there is one thing that entrenched power hates to hear, it's news of a rising star. Well, Herod recognizes the threat to his power, but he's not the only one afraid. According to Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, Herod was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. It's hard to say why. Maybe by Jerusalem here, the author refers to the powerful and the elite, which may make sense since the next verse describes the scribes and Pharisees with whom Herod consults. Or maybe it really means that everyone will be afraid, because after 30 years of Herod's rule, the people know their king is unstable. So they feared any threat to him, not because they loved him, but because they feared his response. In any case, Herod's anxiety sets into motion a terrible genocide. All male children under age 2 are killed in Bethlehem. This recalls Pharaoh's genocide of Hebrew boys, and even in Moses' day, and even the death of the Egyptian firstborn males of Passover. In a time period when children died regularly before reaching maturity, this episode of infanticide was particularly horrid. Matthew later tells us, quoting Jeremiah, that the women were inconsolable. In Ramah, there was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted because they are not. I read it here in the King James Version, that because they are not strikes me as so emptied. Right? People who were and now are not. The loss wasn't just the loss of their beloved children, which would have been enough, but the reminder that they were under the absolute authority, even reproductive authority, of a tyrannical, impetuous, and violent king whose only goal was to maintain his own power. But as Herod knew, his power wouldn't last forever. Right? For the rest of us, we retire. Hopefully, we retire, and that's the end of our job. But for a king, retirement happens at his death. So when a new king is born, it didn't just mean that Herod wouldn't be king anymore. It was also a prediction of his death. Well, he understood that. In his defense, in one of the lyrics from one of my favorite Tom Waits' song, it's the same with dogs as with horses and men. Nothing wants to die. Of course, Herod didn't want to lose his throne, but he wasn't just fighting against this infant for his throne. He was fighting for his life. We don't know if Herod reacted to all potential threats with such asymmetrical warfare, so to speak, in this case by killing an entire birth year of boys. It could be that these magi were the first to visit Herod with news of a new king. It could be that messiahs were popping up all over and that Herod was waging a perpetual war on Christmas. But what we do see, at least in this case, is that Herod is a believer. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you or I were approached by some pagan astrologers who told us that our replacement had been born, we would probably be a little creeped out, but we wouldn't believe it. And in this regard, Herod shows perhaps his only redeeming quality. He believes that Jesus very well might be the Messiah, the new King of the Jews, whose birth promises the people of Israel a new shepherd, as Matthew 2:6 says. What exactly his new king will bring is unclear, but Micah's words, quoted in Matthew, suggest a peace, a return to God, and a justice, the themes that we know concern Micah. And that, of course, is in opposition to Herod's plan for the Jews. And here is the real tragedy of Herod's life. He believes, but he doesn't change. He's in a pantheon of venerated people. He shares with Mary and Joseph, Simeon and Anna, Elizabeth and Zechariah, the shepherds and the magi, he shares with them the good news. He's one of the first to hear the good news of the birth of the Messiah, and he suspects it might be true. He believes enough to kill an unknown number of children. He believes enough to use terror and violence against the people over whom he rules, a tactic that cannot endear him to them and can only ultimately foment dissidence and revolution. I wonder what it's like when the women who lost those infant sons, when they see Jesus, and they see the son that they had who didn't grow up. How will they feel in that moment? Will they be angry at Jesus? Will they be jealous of Jesus and Mary? Will they be hopeful that here's a person who already once defied death and rebuked and was so threatening that he had to be punished, or the authorities sought to punish him for his threat to their power? Well, regardless, Herod does this because he believes. The tragedy isn't his belief, it's his response to it. We see in Herod a man whose love of power produced an anxiety to protect it and a paranoia. As a result, he could never be a good ruler, whether the Messiah came during his rule or not. Imagine if, instead of attempting to protect his power, Herod heard the news that the Magi brought and did as he told them he would do. He sincerely worshipped the newborn king. What if he had valued, as Micah did, peace and justice in his kingdom? If he believed when he had responded with when he believed, he had responded with compliance to God rather than defiance of God. If he had loved the Jews as a shepherd rather than a despot. Well, each Christmas, our family reads The Greatest Christmas Pageant Ever. It's a short comic children's chapter book, and it's also a play. You might have seen it. The Wichita Children's Theater does it, performs it, I think, pretty regularly. It's a short book about the unruly herdman children who interrupt a local church's boring, perfect nativity play with their questions about the birth of Jesus and their anger that anyone would be so unkind to a pregnant woman as the innkeeper was to Mary. But they save most of their outrage for Herod. They are so offended at his violence towards children, which is something that no one else in the church production seems to have been bothered about. They're so offended that they march to the library to find a book that they hope will tell them that Herod ends his life humiliated, deposed, beheaded, dragged into the street. That's the ending they want for Herod. And they are terribly disappointed to discover that Herod the Great apparently died peacefully, we think maybe of heart disease. Because they find this unfair, they ask the play to be rewritten so that the end scene isn't Mary and Joseph gazing at baby Jesus in his swaddling clothes in the manger, but that the end is the public execution of Herod. That's how they think the Christmas story should end. And that's actually a pretty profound theological conclusion to his story. More profound than even these little prophetic children realize, because it echoes the death of Haman in the Esther story. For the herdman children, the Herod sin is his attempt on baby Jesus' life, something very upsetting to the comically pronatal herdmans. And for us too, that is the problem, which is why the babies he did kill are commemorated as Christian martyrs, really the first ones, even before Stephen's stoning by the Sanhedrin. And some traditions in Christianity commemorated the slaughter of the innocents. That's the name for this event this past week. But there's another problem with Herod, and it's one that we're more likely to share with him than we are to share his genocidal tendencies. And that's the failure of belief to transform us, to spur us into action. When we're confronted, like Herod, by God's desire for the world to be turned upside down, but we act in defense of the status quo, we're sinning like Herod. And when we are defensive of our positions rather than open to change, when we hold on to power with a closed fist, striking people who threaten to take it from us, rather than releasing it and sharing it, when we ignore the magi of today who call our attention to God's will for the world, we sin like Herod. Herod reminds us that obedience does not necessarily flow from belief, that it's a choice, like the one Mary made, to participate in God's vision of a new world. In fact, when our faith ends with belief and never results in change, it can be as dangerous as Herod's. Later in the New Testament, in the book of James, the author warns us of this in an imaginary conversation. But someone will say, "You have faith and I have deeds." Well, show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that God is one. Good for you. Even the demons believe that and shudder. I imagine Herod discovering that a new king has been born, shuddering like a demon, not because he didn't believe, but because he did. And he knew, better than many Christians today, I fear, that if Jesus was who the wise men declared he was, then the whole world, him included, would have to change.